Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. I am Akshi Federici. I'm a founding partner at Kraken Ventures. And I'll do a quick background about myself. Before starting Kraken Ventures, I was at Kraken Exchange for about 2 years. And prior to that, I was at Status.im. And prior to that, at Consensus, like a lot of folks here at the conference. I started Consensus's Academy program, which certified developers in Solidity. And before Consensus, I was in traditional financial services. So I was a director at BlackRock in New York. I was also at the Boston Consulting Group for about 8 years as part of the core financial services practice. And I started their hedge fund practice. And probably the most relevant experience that I have is that my undergrad was at IIT, the Indian Institute of Technology and Computer Science. So that's how I got into the blockchain space once Joe exposed me to the Ethereum ecosystem. With that, I just wanted to jump into the topic for today, and it's a quick one, Fintech and Blockchain and the VC perspective there. Before I jump into that, just a quick show of hands. How many people in this room are in the VC space? Okay, perfect. Very few, okay. So I guess the rest of the people will be hopefully learning something new from the talk. And then how many folks here are founders looking for VC funding? Gotcha. And how many operators? That includes developers, engineers, product people? Gotcha. Okay, cool. One last question, actually. How many people have prior background in financial services? Perfect. Thank you for that. Okay, so let's jump in. This is probably the silliest slide in my slide deck. And the reason I bring this up is because people often forget what fintech actually means and sometimes assume that it's a very niche space and that it's very narrowly defined. However, the definition that I think is the most appropriate for the rest of my talk is the Forbes one, where fintech is just simply a portmanteau of financial technology. So any technology, whether it's blockchain or non-blockchain, that is used to either reinforce or reinvent financial services and the delivery of that is essentially fintech. And the reason I wanted to highlight that is because often as a VC and even as a fund, I hear funds talking about how they invest in either fintech or crypto or blockchain. And for me, it's really not that different at all, not just between fintech and crypto/blockchain, but also between pure financial services and the blockchain. Another thing, at least in my perspective, is that I really think about our industry as blockchain, and of course, this is evident to most of the people in this room since you're at ECC, but you'd be surprised how many LPs and investors into VC funds really think about the crypto space as just crypto, as opposed to blockchain. So that's just one quick thing. And of course, it's interesting that the street actually uses cryptocurrencies as part of the definition of fintech. So moving on from there, I think one of the frameworks that I use to look at how blockchain and fintech can work together is to simply divide it up into reinforcing fintech versus redesigning fintech. And in the reinforcement bucket, of course, you have middle and back office optimization. That's kind of the most obvious application. And streamlining it is core to some of the fundamental tenets of the blockchain, and that's why it's so well suited. But I think going forward, things like RPA, robotic process automation, and AI can work so seamlessly with blockchain that I think it's a perfect use case. For example, I think it was in the 1990s that at MIT they discovered, or invented, I should say, OCR, right? Or for example, AI is starting now to analyze reports kind of automatically and flag issues. And then on the right-hand side, what is personally most exciting is obviously net new business models. I wouldn't say that those are obviously the hardest to accomplish because of hurdles and, I guess, inherent constraints of the blockchain, which we'll get to later. But even so, there are some very interesting applications. So for example, all of DeFi, or even just having digital wallets, because at the very simplest, at its core, they're essentially no-frills bank accounts that are also payment gateways, right? So that in itself is an innovation in the fintech space off the bat. But Even more so if you think about, for example, insurance underwriting. For the most part, historically, there has been no difference in terms of insurance policies given to people where, that are non-smokers, non-alcoholics, and just have certain body, BMI indices. And those are all quantifiable. But then, for example, there are unquantifiable or sort of qualitative aspects that are just not factored into the underwriting process. So that's another space that there's quite a bit of innovation going on. And that last one is mistyped. It's actually global access and inclusion. Global access inclusion, that would make sense. So that obviously makes it really exciting. So this slide here is quite outdated in terms of the logos that are on here, especially given the markets in the current situation. I'm sure that there are quite a few logos here that are not relevant anymore, but of course there are other ones that we should be adding on here. But the point that I wanted to highlight here is that every part of the stack for fintech delivery, starting with like the infrastructure layer to the middleware to then the application and solutions built on top of it, can either be both reinforced by blockchain but also reinvented by blockchain. So that framework that I talked about in the prior slide just kind of applies to all three of these of the stack. And despite whatever's happened in the markets, at least from a VC perspective, one of the big kind of pieces of hope, I guess, for us, for the industry, is that the tech stack today versus when even I started in the space several years ago is just much, much better. So digging into that a little bit more, and this is where I started to write out this slide, and then there was just so much that I could put on here that I had to leave some things blank. But in general, every aspect of fintech and financial services pretty much today is being touched by blockchain. So whether it's capital markets, asset management, of course, payments and remittances was one of the early applications, but then, insurance, compliance, et cetera. So even when I look at this chart, I try to use that lens of what is just simply reinforcing and augmenting current solutions versus what is net new. So for example, in let's see, asset management. So within asset management, tokenization of assets or even just cryptocurrencies as an asset class, let's say, is an innovation versus traditional asset management. And then on the insurance side, for example, same thing, tokenized reinsurance markets, very, very innovative versus the traditional industry. And then, of course, you have the entire slew of the compliance, KYC, AML, et cetera, stuff that is more kind of augmenting or streamlining. But yes, this is, I guess for me, the takeaway is that every single aspect of financial services, not just fintech, is essentially going to use blockchain. So some of the hurdles, I think on the left side, we are pretty familiar from like an operator tech, product perspective with respect to the infrastructure itself. So obviously scalability in terms of, transactions per second, et cetera, but then also, things like interoperability or integration with legacy systems, access. I mean, it's like both sides of the coin. I think philosophically speaking, when we look at businesses, the question is, great, this is globally accessible, but you do kind of need an internet connection for it. So how does that actually work in your business model and revenue model for the target audience? So those are the kinds of practicality questions we're looking at when we look at projects. And then on the regulation side, there are, I should have actually called that legal and regulatory as opposed to just regulation, but there are still questions around jurisdiction. So if the blockchain is truly global, how does liability work if there are, if there's a breakdown or if there's some sort of like a liability question that comes up in one jurisdiction but was initiated by a programmer in another jurisdiction? Is it the programmer of the smart contracts that's liable? Like, who is actually the liable party? These are things that haven't actually been solved from a legal perspective. Another kind of interesting thing for me in general was that apparently there is no legal court in any country globally that has yet recognized the blockchain as an immutable ledger or proof of ownership. And this was like a mind-blowing thing for me, which is like in our community, we're just kind of sitting there and saying, obviously the technology provides all these different things, but from if anything were ever to be taken to court, and if someone was like, here, I have this house and I own this asset because of this certificate on the blockchain, it really, truly, in today's legal system globally, just does not hold up. And these are things that we have to, really think about when we look at projects. So the next thing here that I quickly wanted to highlight, though, especially given the markets and in the last like year and a half in the VC space, because this is sort of switching to, okay, so what's the activity in the VC space with respect to crypto, fintech, blockchain? What is really interesting is that roughly 8 to 9 of the 50 top innovative companies in fintech for 2 years consistently in the last 2 years have been crypto/blockchain first companies. And I believe that for the list last year, I think other than 2 of the players there, pretty much every other player has been a unicorn, right? Obviously, we'd have to adjust for the markets recently, but I think it's extremely encouraging from a VC perspective to see this. This is kind of my take on fintech, financial services, blockchain, those 3 completely being inseparable and indecipherable going forward, indistinguishable, I should say, from each other going forward, is that there are more so than ever traditional financial services institutions that are betting on the blockchain and crypto space. And it's almost become a table stakes at this point for them to have, a group that is actually providing this to customers or investing in it or looking at it to enhance their own products and offerings and technology, et cetera. So, and this data, I don't think it has a date on it, but essentially it's from, I believe, August of last year. So a little bit dated, but it's representative. So then the last 2 slides that I have here was kind of in the same vein to say what are the big financial services institutions, the traditional ones that are investing in blockchain, sorry. And I think since I'm at ECC, maybe this is fresh in my mind versus consensus a few weeks ago or months ago, time is a blur, is that there is obviously a lot of frustration from a regulatory perspective in the United States, and there's this view that a lot of innovation in crypto, fintech, blockchain, et cetera, is going to come from external to the United States, particularly in developing countries, et cetera. And I think that that is absolutely true. But what was really encouraging for me when I looked at this, and these are the top banks in terms of the size of their investments from a VC arm perspective into the crypto space, the majority of the sizes of the checks as well as the number of players on this page are actually United States. So that's extremely encouraging, and I feel like, from our perspective, that would be a huge win from a regulatory perspective if this can all be turbocharged. We shall see what that means in terms of the markets and the current situation, but it was really interesting to watch that this is sort of the case. So that's kind of the end of my presentation. I did end a little bit early because I know that we were supposed to have Q&A time at the end of the presentation, but I do have to run to catch a flight in a couple of minutes, but I will be happy to take a couple of questions at this point if someone had any. That was easy. Cool. Thanks, guys.